Okay, Romans 13 is where we're going to be today. By the way, I appreciate the little handout, brother. It's really good for taking notes on stuff. Romans 13. I've been wanting to preach on Romans 13 for quite a while. I think it's very important that we come to an understanding of exactly what Romans 13 is telling us as born-again Christians. Because there's been some misinterpretation of it by really good men over the years. Or some misapplication of it. Let me put it that way. Not misinterpretation perhaps, but misapplication. The title of this message is Our Christian Obligation to an Abusive American Government. Now, we're Christians first, and we're Americans second. That probably tells you where this message is going. Well, we are coming into an era that's already started of abusive government. So how do we respond to that? How do we live with that? We've already talked a little bit this morning before we started recording here about why that has occurred. Because our best men, God's best men, are no longer serving in government. But God's best men were the ones who founded this nation. And if you don't know what the Black Robe Regiment is and how it served us during that Revolutionary War period, go find out. Romans 13, we're going to read the first 8 verses here. Oh, that's not 1 Corinthians, Chuck. It's Romans. Let's say something doesn't look right. Okay, Romans 13. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God. And they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. For he is the minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid. For he beareth not the sword in vain. For he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. Wherefore ye must needs be subject, not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake. For this cause pay ye tribute also, for they are God's ministers, attending continually upon this very thing. Render therefore to all their dues, tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. Owe no man anything but to love one another, for he that loveth another hath fulfilled the law. All right, we're going to take these first 8 verses here, and we're going to talk about them a little bit. And where I want to start with it is to try and synopsize these 8 verses concerning our Christian obligation to the state. We are subject to higher powers, and we submit to them without resistance because God has ordained them, regardless of how they were appointed. God has intended them to be terrors to evil work. That's very clear to me. They are ministers for good works. They are intended to keep social order. They are intended to uphold justice according to God's established plan and laws. They are responsible for providing a safe environment for their citizens. Now, if any rulers of the state, and when I say state, I mean locality, in our case, state or nation. When I say state, I mean any nation in the world. Rulers are intended to do these things we just talked about. And if they operate contrary to these things, in other words, rather than be a terror to evil work, they become a terror to good work, they do so at their own peril, because God ordained them. Says so very clearly here. So then the Christian is to respect that authority that God has ordained and to be law-abiding. Whatever the law of the land is, we're to be law-abiding. In addition to that, we are to pay reasonable tax rates. If taxes become unbearable, we should have civil recourse, a way to redress that, to go to some authority to appeal. You've taxed me too heavily. You've taxed me wrong. You got my property zoned incorrectly. We're supposed to have redress for that, but we're supposed to pay those taxes. We are to respect and pay fair prices for our products. Pay the merchant a fair price for a quality product. We are to pay fair wages for a fair day's labor. We're to give a fair day's labor for a fair day's wage. We're not to gripe about that. We're to render honor to whom honor is due. We are to keep ourselves out of debt. Now, I will say this. Since World War II, we've been slowly working our way into a dystopian environment in this nation, and it's become absolutely necessary in many, maybe most cases, for a husband and wife both to work. That is a whole different sermon that I may preach someday. Because I've watched it now. I'm old enough. I've seen it happen. And you can't raise a family unless both husband and wife are working. You can't afford it. And so there is debt. We have debt today. But we need to treat the debt honorably. If you have to have credit, pay your bills. Don't get more credit than you can manage. You may have to do without. A lot of us have. Get along with all of our fellow citizens, Christian and non-Christian alike. That's paramount, or we cannot have a civil society. There won't be any peace if we can't get along with Christians and non-Christians. We'll talk about that. Now, before I continue here in Romans 13, I want to make one point very clear. Romans 13 is dealing specifically with civil government. The original language makes it very clear. We're talking about civil government here. It's not to be conflated or confused with Hebrews 13. If you got a minute, turn there to Hebrews 13 and look at verse 17. Obey them that have the rule over you, and submit yourselves, for they watch for your souls as they that must give account, that they may do it with joy and not with grief, for that is unprofitable for you. Now, I think all of you here today know that this is speaking of the elders of the Lord's churches. So Hebrews 13 here in this verse has to do with the eternal nature of the religious hierarchy or religious government, if you will, and organization in our churches. That's a totally different subject. No, but you know what? The Christian, for us, it's really not possible to completely separate the two. Because if our civil government is just and honorable, then we also honor them, just as we do our deacons and pastors and teachers and all elders. You know, that includes women too, by the way. A lot of women are Sunday school teachers and should be. And they need to be obeyed and honored too. So God's established. Now listen, here's another reason we can't separate these two. Totally. We got to understand they're talking about different things. But you can't separate them in a general sense, and here's why. I hope I can explain this, but God has established government. And He means for government to reflect His divine laws, His divine will, and His revealed word. No nation is blessed unless the Lord is their God. No nation is blessed unless the Lord is their God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Every nation, civil government, was instituted by God and meant to reflect His revealed will in our Bibles. Just the same way as He expects the Christian who is born again to reflect Christ. God called Abram out of a pagan world. And He told him, I'm going to build a nation of you. And He did. God declared His own nation, His own people, Israel. They will be restored. They may be blinded to Christ now, but they'll be unblinded. The veil will be removed. Now, no nation can be blessed unless they are a friend to Israel. They must be a friend to Abraham. Genesis declares it. I believe it's in chapter 12. God told Abraham, I will bless those that bless you, and I will curse those that curse you. Oh, I pray America continues always to stand with Israel. Any nation that opposes Israel opposes God. So, one of the reasons, again, we must understand the two different subjects, Hebrews 13, verse 17, and Romans 13. Hebrews 13, Romans 13. You got to understand they're different subjects. But you got to understand that when government is living according and operating according to God's will, and when the Christian is living according to God's will, we honor both the same. Okay. And that, the fact that civil governments are meant to operate according to God's will is exactly why Paul writes here that civil rulers are not a terror to good works. And if they become a terror to good works, they're operating in contradiction to God's revealed will. They do that at their own peril. They're going to pay for that. Now, Paul, writing to the church in Rome, said back in chapter 12, I'm going to look at verses 17 and 18, and this goes back to where I said earlier in my synopsis of these first 8 verses that we're to get along with all our fellow citizens, Christian and non-Christian alike. Paul, back in chapter 12, verse 17 and 18, he says, "Recompense to no man evil for evil. Provide things honest in the sight of all men. If it be possible, as much as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men." You know what? All men will not live peaceably. That's a problem for the Christian, isn't it? The other thing I want you to understand in Romans 13, Paul is addressing things in a general way here. This is generally how things are supposed to go. He's not citing specifics. Keep that in mind. "And all men will not live peaceably, and all nations will not govern responsibly in accordance with God's declared will." Now, there are probably several reasons that Paul chose to address this particular subject that he is opening up in Romans 13 in this public letter. We're going to look at 2 of them. First of all, it was to make sure that every Christian understood that civil government was ordained of God. And therefore, civil government had to be respected, and Christians had to teach others the proper deference to civil government. The second was probably to allay the fears that the Roman government may have had toward this growing sect of Christians, because Christians declare that their king is Jesus Christ, and Christians declare they are building an eternal, supernatural empire here on earth. Now, this can scare some people. I think it probably scares some people in Washington, D.C. in today's time. I mean that. Based on how they react to Christians and Christ-like things. So I think Paul, inspired by the Spirit, had some of these things in mind. So Romans 13 then is written in a generally descriptive manner, defining the Christian perspective towards and relationships with the state. He was not writing about specifics, but he was addressing general attitudes here. During the time Paul was incarcerated, during the time he wrote this epistle, Rome was a pagan government. It's perfectly reasonable to assume that there were things according to Roman law that definitely were not Christ-like. It's reasonable to assume, I don't have any history to quote to you, but I'm sure we could easily find it, that a lot of these Roman emperors and rulers were very unchristlike and committed some horrible atrocities and sins. But that wasn't the point. Paul was writing that inasmuch as the Christian can live peaceably within the government, the operational government, and as long as the operational government and the authorities were tolerant of Christian faith and practice, life was good. It's a lot better when you have a life like our original America. But life was tolerable. It was okay. So if a pagan government is tolerable, and I would say today in America we have a pagan government. Now you may not like that. I guess you'll have to lump it because I'm not going to change that. I can pull too many things out of current events that indicate to me, operationally speaking, we have a majorative attitude that is more pagan than Christian. I'm not happy about that, but that's what it seems like to me. But if the pagan government's tolerable to Christian practice and belief, then the Christian is not to resist, not to rebel, but to submit to authority. But what happens when that government becomes overbearing, overreaching, tyrannical, and oppressive, and will not tolerate Christian belief or practice? What happens then? Does the Christian still submit and follow the tyrannical and oppressive laws imposed on them? When that happens, the Christian is greatly discomfited, I would say. I'm afraid that in America, it appears to me that we are quickly headed in that direction. Unless the Lord, and I pray He will, give us a respite, He'll give us a window of space, He'll restore us for a little period of time. I hope that period of time is a couple of 100 years. But we're in bad shape, folks. And we're already under judgment. There are two major shifts in civil government which have caused great concern for us as Christians in America today. And I want to talk about two of them, those two, briefly here today. Now, I'm going to say, first of all, that I think this is of greater concern to us who are older, because we remember a different time. And we lived through an age that we could still call an age of civility in our youth that is no longer here. We lived in an age where Christian ethics and Christian practice was manifested throughout society, no matter where you went in America. I'm not saying everybody was a saved Christian, but I'm saying Christian practice was normal, was the day. That was the normal, not the new normal. But that's how it was. I was thinking when I was sitting down and reading and laboring over this, praying about it, an old law came to my mind. No spitting on the sidewalk. That was a law. And it went without saying. Now, I've told this before too. I started working really young. And I started working hard physical jobs when I was young. And I worked with some pretty rough men. But I don't care how rough they were. If any women or children came around, you cleaned up your mouth. And any man that didn't paid for it, let me tell you. It was a different time. So these things that have occurred may impact us who are older a little harder because we see it more clearly. A greater contrast for us. But these two major concerns that ought to be red flags for any Christian or any peace-loving, law-abiding American citizen are number one, freedom of speech. And number two is targeted law enforcement with the assumption of guilt until proven innocent. Now, you don't have to look too hard to see both of these things occurring recently in the recent past, in the last 5 to 10 years. Freedom of speech is a hallmark of our American federal republic, not democracy. We are a federal republic. We're not a democracy. Democracy is mob rule. That's why we have an electoral college. We're a federal republic. Now, this freedom of speech can be a double-edged sword. As Christians, we're dissuaded from and don't like to hear vulgar, coarse language. And we don't like offensive speech. And yet we know, because we're aware of the moral depravity of man, that it's out there. And that we're going to hear it, sometimes even if we don't want to. So we don't all come together and pounce on anyone who offends us, because mature people understand that's going to happen. You know, as I said, we remember a time of greater civility, those of us who are older, and we recognize that vulgar language, coarse language, mocking language, immaturely offensive language is just not acceptable in a social setting, and it's never conducive to mature discussion, particularly if that discussion is trying to resolve a contentious issue. But what do you see now? What do you see in any contentious issue? Even our elected officials, anyone on YouTube, anyone on internet streaming, anyone on TV, and they're just sitting there yelling and screaming and cussing at each other. Really? What happened to civil discourse? We do not have it now. I quit watching Fox News years ago, but it pretty much devolved into a screaming match. And then the other networks, they just have a commentator that's entirely liberal and talks over the other guy. That's not an intellectual exchange of opposing viewpoints for the purpose of arriving at a mature decision or resolution to a contentious issue. Well, okay. Since Barack Obama, a lot of these things have changed. And when we look at a more Christian America that was prevalent in society years and years ago, it all started to really change. And I can look back and see a lot of this now. Perhaps some of you can too. But it really started to change with the introduction of this political correctness. And it gradually grew. And it gradually attained a widespread acceptance till you just kind of had to live by it everywhere. Is that a good thing? And then it just exploded with Barack Obama and his administration as president, when he was president. Today, offensive language has taken on an entirely new meaning. It doesn't mean coarse, vulgar, ungodly language. Because that stuff's very popular today. I mean, you can't watch hardly any entertainment show or sports show or anything without F-bombs and everything else, just every other word. It's nasty. It just is. But it's not offensive. According to the world we're living in America today, that doesn't seem to offend anyone. You hear that kind of language in Congress. Remember all those people? Until Keith Ellison came along, everybody was sworn in on the Bible. He was sworn in on the Quran. Now there was a big problem for America. Offensive language now means anything politically non-liberal. Anything Christian-like in nature. Anything that's reality-based from a biblical perspective. If you believe in the Bible and you have any comment to be made about anything from a biblical perspective, that's offensive. In short, it's anything the woke crowd says is offensive. They're a bunch of snowflake crybabies. They're immature. Everything hurts my feelings. It's sick. My sincere hope is that every born-again Christian American is aware that freedom of speech is under attack. It's being greatly eroded. And if it is lost, I'm going to tell you what it will mean. It'll mean that eventually there's no more public prayer, no more public Christian testimony. You'll be arrested, fined, incarcerated, may get to where you're executed. I don't know. But it will eventually lead to arrest, confinement, fines. Christians have been killed before by intolerant governments and radical religions. It'll lead to the shutting down of all true churches. I ain't going to leave these doors open if it gets to that point, if we allow our freedom of speech to go away. There's an article, January 30th, 2024, by a fellow named Jordan Boyd in The Federalist. The Federalist is a respected, legitimate publication. It's a conservative publication. He gives us just such an example. He writes of a dad of 11, I'm quoting, dad of 11, his name is Paul Vaughn. I'm quoting, arrested and convicted by the Biden administration's DOJ for praying alongside 5 other pro-lifers at an abortion facility. He was convicted for unconstitutional freedom of access to clinic entrances, FACE Act, and engaging in a conspiracy against rights. His sentencing is scheduled for next month, July 2nd, 2024, for praying at an abortion factory. You know what he faces? Up to 11 years in prison and up to $260,000 in fines. This is not only an example of losing free speech, but also an example of the second thing that bothers me. It's political targeting of law enforcement. Lawfare is the new term for it. These are serious things. Mr. Vaughn's case reveals both of those things. It reveals a growing intolerance for Christian beliefs and practice. It also exposes tyrannical government overreach of targeted law enforcement. That's something we never saw in America until Barack Obama and his administration came along. The Obama administration didn't like police. And except for 4 years of Trump, police have never been popular again. I'm thankful for police. I'm thankful for law enforcement. Now, there's a second article I want to bring to your attention. This article is by a woman named Olivia Prenzel, Prentzel, writing for the Colorado Sun newspaper out of Denver. After 3 days of deliberation, I'm quoting, after 3 days of deliberation, a jury convicted Rebecca Lavrenz, Lavrenz, of Falcon, Colorado, on 4 misdemeanor counts. The title of the article was, Colorado Springs area woman known as January 6th Praying Grandma found guilty of breaching U.S. Capitol during January 6th riot to disrupt the results of the 2020 presidential election. Rebecca Lavrenz, known on social media as January 6th Praying Grandma, was convicted on charges of entering and remaining in a restricted building, disorderly and disruptive conduct in the Capitol, and parading or picketing in the Capitol. Okay, that's the end of the quote. Now listen to this. This 71-year-old grandma is the owner of a bed and breakfast. 71-year-old grandma. Owner of a bed and breakfast. Northeast of Colorado Springs. She was arrested almost a year later, December 19th, 2022, as a result of social media tipsters. We know who they are. We know what they're like. The surveillance footage shows her in the building for 10 minutes. It shows her walking around. It shows her standing. It shows her wearing a red scarf and a white hat. Now, Christian, you be the judge. You be the judge. Who is guilty of what in that example? What's reasonable and what's not in that example? Now, I don't make any judgment as to whether or not it was smart for anyone to be there on that day. But I will say a bunch of innocent people were there on that day. A bunch of patriotic American citizens were there on that day. A lot of people that just wanted to celebrate and feel good about being Americans were there on that day. And they readily admitted what their surveillance footage showed. What did it sound like to you? Well, I'll tell you what. When I think of so many other factors that I've observed and found out about since that day, there are a lot of questions to be asked, a lot of pondering. And that would include video, which appears to show Capitol Police opening the doors and inviting people in. That's what it appears, certainly what it looks like on film. It includes video showing the murder of an unarmed U.S. military veteran, Ashley Babbitt. As far as I know, there's still no charges to Mr. Byrd, who murdered her. It also includes video, suggestive video, I'm going to call it, showing the supposed beating or trampling of Rosanne Boyland. Suggestive footage of Ray Epps planting a pipe bomb. It includes, in my mind, the continual arrests of some citizens as much as 4 years almost after that thing happened. I also could cite the reportedly harsh confinement conditions and mistreatment of many who've been incarcerated now for years, and the lack of due process and a speedy trial by a jury of their peers. What happened to that? I have a lot of questions. I have a lot of questions about the current state of our government. So, we asked a question. We posed something. What is our Christian obligation to an abusive American government? Well, we've already talked about the fact that we don't have to wonder about what God's will is for government or for us as Christians. We know what it is. What happens when government operates outside the law of divine appointment? What happens when Christians do and continue to and will not repent? They're removed. So all these people who are operating outside of God's will do so at their own peril. What about us as Christians? Whose rules do we follow? The government's? If we lose our freedoms and we're targeted by an overreaching government, what are we to do? Our brother here has talked a lot about the Apostle Peter. A lot of Peter's life was great for us to know because we could learn from it. And sometimes he wouldn't have been good to follow. But I tell you what, in the case of Acts chapter 5 and verse 29, Peter's the right one to follow. Because he told the ruling class of the Jews very clearly. Then Peter and the other apostles answered and said, we ought to obey God rather than men. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. And now I'm reading Ecclesiastes 12, verses 13 and 14. Because here is where government leaders need to understand the Christian is going to live by this rule. Ecclesiastes 12, verses 13 and 14. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. In other words, there's no more to talk about. This is what we're doing. Fear God and keep His commandments. For this is the whole duty of man. For God shall bring every work into judgment with every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil. That's the whole duty of man and the whole duty of our civil government right here in America. And if they're conspiring, if they're overreaching, if they're tyrannical, if they're oppressive, if they're not upholding the law but abusing it, God knows and He'll hold them accountable. In the meantime, we obey God and not men. That's all I have today, brother.